Having looked at the very top of the logistical chain of command, I want to turn to the lowest level officer in that chain. It is interesting to note that this position held the rank of captain and not lieutenant. As I have explained, the doctoral thesis of Lynette Taylor was the basis of the life of Simon Perkins, Jr. The reason he was selected was the trove of over 20,000 box documents that his relatives retained rather than discarding after his death. Aside from the wealth of material, Perkins is an example of the small number of people of great ability who worked in the bowels of the supply system. What is in his background that prepared him for the role he was to play? He came from a military family. His grandfather fought in the War of 1812, and his father was an officer in the Ohio militia. But these forebearers were only part-time officers. Banking and transportation were their real professions, as were the careers of other Perkins family members. Young Simon worked informally in his father's railroad office, but his formal OJT business education came from a position in an iron manufacturing concern owned by David Todd, a close friend of the family. In 1858, he took a job in a Cleveland bank owned by his uncle. By the time the Civil War broke out, Perkins was very well versed in finance, banking, and almost every aspect of running a railroad. Clearly, he fit the model that Meigs desired in his officers. Besides his business abilities, Simon had an amiable personality and a sense of humor that helped him make friends easily. He volunteered when Lincoln called for troops in April of 1861. His career as a private was short-lived. In spite of the fact that he could have used family connections to obtain a commission in a fighting unit, Simon pursued the role of an Army businessman. Knowing the governor of Ohio certainly did not hurt his pursuit. In February of 1862, he reported to Colonel Swords in Louisville as a captain. In addition to the Perkins illustrations I have been telling you, there is one small story which will serve to illustrate that he, like Meigs, hit the ground running. First, you need to understand that there was no training camp for supply officers. Everything they needed to know had to be learned on the job or brought to the job from prior experience. So picture this newly minted captain reporting into General Buell in Nashville on February 25th. The city had just fallen the day before. Imagine the chaos of 10,000 Union troops all looking to set up camp would cause. Perkins and two fellow quartermasters were perhaps the busiest men in town. While the combat personnel were enjoying a little downtime, these three were trying to bring order to the tangle that was the supply situation in the city. Here is what they did. River steamers were directed to newly repaired docks so that they could unload troops, wagons, animals, harnesses, rations, hospital supplies, clothing, and all manner of equipage. The retreating Confederates had burned both the railroad and the public suspension bridges spanning the river, so supplies arriving by rail in the yard at Edgefield had to be ferried to Nashville. Wagon traffic had to be routed from the makeshift supply dumps, and they were just dockside dumps, to where they were needed in the field. Since Nashville was to become the central supply base for Buell, this had to be systematically planned in the middle of execution. In his first days in service as quartermaster, Perkins performed tirelessly in making sure that the logistics of the Army, now based here, were effectively and efficiently executed. I would ask any one of you, could you have done that? While I will not claim that all junior officers in the quartermaster's department were as good as Simon Perkins was, most of them were. This is how a few good men got the job done. Finally, we should turn our attention to middle management. I have touched on Thomas Swords a couple of times during this presentation. You will remember that in 1838, Congress passed legislation allowing for 30 commissioned quartermaster officers at the rank of captain or above. Swords was one of that group of 30. Of course, he was no spring chicken, being 55 years old by 1861. And what he brought to the table was tremendous continuity in the workings of the quartermaster department. He and 9 other officers from the 30 had worked day in and day out with Jessup and his system of supply. His over 20 years of experience in the job made Meggs's job so much easier. And that just counted his time in a senior command position. He was actually in a quartermaster's position right out of graduation from West Point in 1829. While this is not a Civil War story, the following will give you some idea of what kind of a take-charge guy this chap was. At the beginning of the war with Mexico, Swords rode with Stephen Kearny to San Diego. Upon arrival, he realized that there were few local sources for clothing and other goods the men needed. Responding to this problem, he chartered a ship to take him to the Sandwich Islands, today's Hawaii, about 2,200 miles away. After 18 days at sea, he landed in Honolulu, where he bought garments and construction materials on government credit. He then sailed back safely and distributed his supplies. Since Swords was Perkins' boss and worked directly for Meggs, many of the brief vignettes I have been telling you about all evening centered on his command. From all accounts I have read, Thomas Swords carried out his duties both efficiently and effectively. In June of 1862, he was in charge of the Louisville Depot. A potential supplier approached Swords offering a kickback. Swords wrote the following back to the gentleman. In regard to my retaining whatever percentage I wish to pay me for my trouble, I have to inform you that I am paid by the United States for trouble and everything else incident to my office. Such were the men serving in the quartermaster's department. It was my objective this evening to relate to you a few details about Northern Supply during the years 1861 to 1862. I trust I presented the material in an orderly manner. You will recall that I started out with Bob's question about dropping stuff on the battlefield. I suggested to you that while this did happen, it was not the disaster I believed it to be. After telling you a bit about myself, I proceeded to give 9 examples of Union losses and their impact on supply. The biggest hit the North took was the capture of federal installations at the time of secession. From here we proceeded to develop the reason why Quartermaster Department worked so well and the story of Jessup. At this point I felt comfortable introducing one of the original thoughts of my own. That was the difference between technology and information and its impact on the management of logistics. Since the basis of information was accounting, there was the necessity to explain a little of the bookkeeping of the war. I concluded my talk with perhaps the most important element of all. That would be the men who made it happen. I, for one, was most impressed with the quality of those who served in the quartermaster's department. To me, it was very close to what Churchill said about the men of the RAF in World War II. Never, in the field of human conflict, was so much owed by so many to so few.